So if you were to walk into like any major art museum in the world right now, bypass all the modern wings and just head straight for the classical European galleries, you'd be surrounded by centuries of religious iconography.
Oh, absolutely. Just walls and walls of it.
Right. And if you specifically looked for the ultimate defining symbol of biblical sacrifice, you would find the exact same image repeated over and over again.
Yeah, you really would.
You'd see it in, Jan van Eyck's famous Dent altarpiece from the 15th century. You'd see it in stained glass windows in rural medieval churches and even modern cathedrals. It is this image that is soft, gentle, and entirely docile. It's the Lamb.
It is arguably the most dominant theological icon in Western history, really.
Yeah, we have this culturally ubiquitous phrase, the Lamb of God, and it has just completely saturated our collective imagination. Like, when we think of the ultimate spiritual sacrifice, we picture this quiet, fluffy, unresisting little sheep.
Which makes sense. I mean, that imagery of the gentle substitutionary lamb has framed how billions of people over 2 millennia understand the concept of innocence and, atonement and divine grace.
Exactly.
It is the lens through which the entire biblical narrative is typically viewed.
Right, which makes total sense given the way popular culture distills complex ideas into simple visuals. But I was reading through this fascinating new research, and it essentially asks a massive paradigm-shifting question.
It really does. It flips everything.
It really does. It asks, what if that culturally dominant image of the Lamb is actually overriding a much older, significantly more powerful, and frankly, much more disruptive ancient symbol?
Which is a heavy question to throw at people.
Totally.
Right.
Like, what if we trace the original texts back to their earliest origins, stripping away the centuries of European art, and we find that the sacrificial animal at the very top of the ancient hierarchy wasn't a lamb at all?
Right. What if it was something else entirely?
Yeah, what if it was the most dominant, heavily muscled, aggressive beast of burden in the ancient Near East?
That changes the tone of the theology entirely. I mean, you are moving from something that represents pure passivity to something that embodies immense strength.
Yeah.
And economic power and leadership. It just redefines the very nature of what a divine sacrifice is supposed to represent.
It completely flips the script. And that is exactly what we are unpacking in this deep dive today. We are looking at a profoundly detailed typological and linguistic study by an author named Frank Leo.
And the depth of his linguistic research is just staggering.
It really is. And just to give you, the listener, a sense of the sheer linguistic depth we are about to plunge into, the author actually publishes this research under 3 names, reflecting the 3 languages involved. So there's Frank Leo, his Hebrew name Moshe Halevi, and his Greek name Frankiskos Moises Louitakis.
Which is incredibly appropriate, honestly.
Yeah.
Because to truly grasp the magnitude of what he has uncovered, we can't just look at an English translation of the Bible.
Right. English won't cut it here.
No, we have to navigate across 3 distinct linguistic worlds. We are going to have to travel through ancient biblical Hebrew, then into the spoken 1st century Aramaic of the Roman era, and finally into the Koine Greek of the early Christian church.
So our mission today is to decode ancient symbols, trace linguistic roots, and look at some of the oldest hidden pictographs in human history. We are going to explore the symbolic link between the Levitical bull, yes, a full-grown bull, and the Christological sacrifice of the cross.
That's a huge journey.
It is. And just to clarify our terms as we get started, when we say Christological, we are simply referring to the study of the nature, role, and acts of Christ. We are going to find a visual, literal blueprint connecting an ox to the crucifixion, hidden right inside the alphabet itself.
And what makes this study so compelling is that it forces us to re-examine how language even functions.
Yeah, how so?
Well, we tend to think of the letters of our alphabet as just a collection of arbitrary shapes, lines and circles that tell us what sound to make with our mouths.
Right, like A, B, C, just sounds.
Exactly. But what this research suggests is that ancient alphabets function more like compressed data. The very letters might contain highly specific, deeply embedded theological messages that were just waiting thousands of years to be fully unpacked.
I really want to get into the mechanics of those ancient alphabets, but to even understand why the ultimate sacrifice is tied to an ox or a bull, we kind of have to start with the ancient rule book.
We do. We have to look at the law.
Right. We have to look at how Israelite sacrifice actually worked in the Bronze and Iron Ages. Because looking at the book of Leviticus, it becomes very clear that my Sunday school flannel graph memory of everything revolving around a lamb is missing some major historical data.
Oh, absolutely. The primary thing that the popular imagination misses is the strict hierarchy of the sacrificial system.
The hierarchy, right.
Yeah, and to be fair to the average person, this misconception is heavily fueled by the texts of the New Testament itself.
Yeah.
Specifically, the Johannine Declaration, meaning the writings found in the Gospel of John.
Right, John the Baptist.
Exactly. In the first chapter of that Gospel, John the Baptist sees Jesus and famously declares, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world."
And that's the quote. That's the one that stuck.
That one single phrase essentially locked the imagery into place for the next 2,000 years.
It's the ultimate sticky quote. It honestly reminds me of how pop culture handles famous movie lines. Like everyone walks around saying, "Play it again, Sam," when Humphrey Bogart never actually says that in Casablanca.
Oh, that's a great point.
The pop culture version is so catchy and evocative that it completely overwrites the original nuanced script. We've done the exact same thing with the ancient sacrificial system. We've let one powerful metaphor in the New Testament completely overwrite the highly detailed, complex legal code found in the Old Testament.
That is a very apt comparison. Pop culture theology has basically paves over the Levitical code. Because if you actually sit down and read the book of Leviticus, which, let's be honest, is a text most modern readers skip over because it is incredibly dense.
Oh yeah, it's very dry.
Very dense with legal and ritualistic instructions. But if you read it, you don't find a system where a lamb is the ultimate answer to every problem. You find a highly structured socio-religious hierarchy of animals.
So let's break down that hierarchy. If the lamb isn't at the top of the pyramid for ancient Israel, what animal occupies that top spot?
The absolute top of the hierarchy is the young bull.
The bull.
Yes. In ancient Hebrew, the word is par. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek centuries later, in a text known as the Septuagint, the word used was moskos.
Okay, par and mostos.
Right. The young bull occupies the position of absolute primacy as the principal sin offering. And this is vital. The type of animal required is inextricably tied to the social and religious rank of the person making the sacrifice.
Which makes total sense in an ancient agrarian economy. I mean, you wouldn't expect a peasant farmer to bring the exact same offering as the king.
Precisely. Let's look at the specific legal code in Leviticus chapter 4, verse 3. The text outlines the protocol for what happens if the highest-ranking religious figure in the entire nation, the anointed high priest, commits a sin that brings guilt upon the whole community.
So the spiritual stakes for the nation couldn't be higher?
Exactly. The text states, "If the anointed priest shall sin so as to bring guilt upon the people, then he shall offer for his sin, which he has sinned, a young bull of the herd without blemish to the Lord for a sin offering."
A young bull of the herd. And the Hebrew phrase there is par ben bakar, right?
Yes, par ben bakar.
There is absolutely no mention of a lamb anywhere in that instruction.
None whatsoever. The primary crisis requires the primary animal. And this primacy of the bull is amplified even further when you look at Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement.
Right, which was the most solemn, critical day of the entire year for ancient Israel.
It was terrifyingly sacred. This was the one day a year the high priest would pass through the heavy veil and enter the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum of the tabernacle or temple.
To make vicarious atonement for the sins of the entire nation, right?
Yes. It was the absolute peak of the sacrificial system. The atmosphere would have been thick with incense, the weight of national guilt resting entirely on this one ritual.
So, according to the rule book, what blood actually gets taken into that most holy space to secure the atonement?
According to Leviticus 16.11, the ritual begins not with a lamb, but with a bull.
Wow.
The text reads, "Aaron shall bring the bull of the sin offering which is for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house, and shall slaughter the bull of the sin offering."
So it's the bull again.
It is the blood of the par, the bull, that inaugurates this most critical high-stakes atonement ritual. It is the blood of the bull that is sprinkled on the mercy seat.
Okay, so that clearly establishes the bull at the very top. But the lamb has to fit in somewhere, right? Why do we have this massive cultural obsession with the lamb if it's not the main event of the Levitical code?
Well, the lamb, which is the Hebrew word kiv, certainly does appear in the Levitical code. It's an important sacrificial animal. But in the context of the sin offering, you have to read all the way down to Leviticus 4.32 to find it. And when it finally appears, it is explicitly listed as a subordinate secondary option for ordinary individuals of the common people.
So it's essentially the entry-level offering for the general public.
Yes, exactly. The hierarchy is incredibly deliberate and mathematically precise. The greater the societal impact of the sin, and the higher the rank and responsibility of the person offering the sacrifice, the more primary the animal must be to cover it.
Right.
The lamb is for the commoner. But the ox, the young bull, represents the absolute pinnacle of this hierarchy. It is a sacrifice of supreme value.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second here, because I can hear you, the listener, wondering this. I hear what you're saying about the bull being the top-tier animal for the high priest, but does the actual species of the animal fundamentally change the theology?
It's a fair question.
Right. Doesn't a sacrifice just mean something dies in place of something else? Blood is spilled, sins are forgiven? Why does it matter so deeply if it's a lamb or a bull?
It matters deeply because in the ancient Near East, an animal wasn't just a commodity measured in pounds of meat. An animal was a living symbol of attributes. Think about what a lamb represents, not just spiritually, but practically. It represents submission. It is gentle. It is easily led. It requires a shepherd to survive.
It's passive.
Exactly. But an ox, a bull, that is the biological engine of the ancient world, it represents supreme raw strength.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it represents agricultural dominance, leadership, and immense economic power. An ox can plow a field that would take a dozen men to dig by hand. It is the cornerstone of survival in an agrarian society.
It's not just an animal, it's literally the capital equipment of the Bronze Age.
Exactly. So when the highest-ranking official in the nation sins, the required sacrifice isn't something small, gentle, and easily managed. The theology demands the most powerful, valuable, dominant creature available.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense.
The sacrifice must match the gravity of the office and the weight of the sin. Therefore, if we are looking at the Old Testament as a typological preview, a foreshadowing of an ultimate cosmic sacrifice involving a divine king, the Levitical blueprint strictly demands that we look for a bull, not a lamb.
That significantly shifts how we read the text. You're not just sacrificing something innocent, you are sacrificing the very symbol of power, authority, and life-giving agriculture.
Exactly.
Now, Frank Leo's source material takes this a step further. He doesn't just anchor this in the theoretical texts of Leviticus, he anchors it in the historical reality of how these words were actually spoken out loud in ancient synagogues.
Yes.
And he brings up this incredible linguistic artifact called the Secunda Hexapla.
Right, and this is where the scholarly detective work becomes truly fascinating because it bridges the gap between text on a page and the lived religion of ancient people.
I was reading Leo's notes on this, and it absolutely blew my mind. He talks about how this Christian scholar from the 3rd century, Origen of Alexandria, essentially created a massive pronunciation guide for the ancient world.
He did.
Can you expand on the Secunda? Because the effort it must have taken to create this thing in a world before the printing press is almost unimaginable.
It was a monumental feat of scholarship, truly. Origen lived in the 3rd century, roughly around 240 CE. He was based in Alexandria and later Caesarea, which were massive hubs of learning back then.
Right.
And he recognized that there were multiple, sometimes conflicting versions of the Old Testament floating around in Hebrew and Greek. So he spent nearly 30 years compiling a colossal work called the Hexapla.
Hex meaning 6.
Right. It was a comparative edition of the Old Testament laid out in some parallel columns. The first column was the standard Hebrew text. The 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th columns were various Greek translations, like the Septuagint and versions by Aquila and Symmachus.
Okay, that's 5 columns.
But it is the 2nd column, the Secunda, that is the linguistic goldmine for our deep dive today.
Because in that 2nd column, Origen didn't translate the meaning of the Hebrew words. He did something much more specific.
He transliterated them. He took the Hebrew words and spelled them out using Greek letters.
So just to make sure we're all on the same page here, this is like if I were trying to teach someone how to speak French. And instead of telling them that bonjour means hello, I just wrote out B-O-N-Z-H-O-O-R using English letters so they'd know exactly how to move their mouth to make the sound.
That is the perfect analogy. The Secunda is essentially a phonetic transcript. And to understand why this was so revolutionary, you have to remember that ancient biblical Hebrew did not have written vowels.
Oh, wow.
It was a purely consonantal alphabet.
So if you didn't grow up hearing it spoken, you'd just be looking at a string of consonants and basically guessing the sounds in between.
Exactly. The pronunciation was an oral tradition passed down from generation to generation. But Greek does have written vowels.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Yeah, by taking the Hebrew oral tradition and spelling it out phonetically in the Greek alphabet, Origen effectively created an audio time capsule. He recorded exactly how Hebrew was being pronounced in the synagogues of Roman Palestine in the 3rd century.
And we still have access to this.
Well, the complete hexapla was tragically lost. It was likely destroyed during the Arab conquest of Caesarea of the 7th century, but we have significant fragments that survived.
Oh, good.
One of the most important is the Milan palimpsest.
What's a palimpsest?
A palimpsest is a manuscript page where the original text has been scraped off so the expensive parchment could be reused.
Wow, they recycled it.
Exactly. But modern technology allows us to see the faint original writing underneath. Through these fragments, scholars can reconstruct the exact phonology, the soundscape of the ancient world.
So how does Origen's 3rd century pronunciation guide help Frank Leo figure out this connection to the sacrificial bull?
It proves that the theology of the bull wasn't just some abstract legal code buried in a scroll. It was a spoken, resonant reality in the daily religious lives of the people. Okay, when linguists apply the established rules of the Secunda to the Hebrew text of Leviticus 4.3, we can see exactly how the phrase for young bull par ben bakar was vocalized in the synagogues.
How was it vocalized?
It was pronounced far ben bakar. In the Yom Kippur text of Leviticus 16.11, the bull of the sin offering was spoken aloud as the far.
It grounds the text in reality. The word echoing through the synagogues, the word being spoken by the rabbis and heard by the congregation, was the bull, the far.
Exactly. It anchors our investigation in the tangible historical environment of the Roman era. The highest paradigm of sacrifice embedded in the auditory memory of the culture was the bull.
Okay, this brings us to a massive, glaring transition point in the text. We have firmly established that the ultimate top-tier sacrifice in the Old Testament rulebook is the bull.
Yes.
But if we are looking for the symbolic link between that Levitical bull and the Christological sacrifice of the New Testament, we kind of have a problem.
We do.
Because if you read the Gospels, Jesus never walks around calling himself a bull. He never says, I am the young bull of the sin offering.
No, he does not. And if we limit our reading purely to the Greek texts of the New Testament, the linguistic trail just seems to go cold.
Right.
To find the connection, we have to dig beneath the Greek text. We have to look at the daily conversational language that Jesus and his earliest followers actually spoke. We have to explore what linguists call the Aramaic substratum.
The Aramaic substratum. Let's really dig into this because this is where the historical context gets fascinating. We read the New Testament in English, which was translated primarily from ancient Greek manuscripts.
Correct.
But Jesus, Peter, James, and John weren't walking around the Sea of Galilee speaking Greek to the local fishermen, right?
No, they weren't. First century Roman Palestine was a highly complex, multilingual environment. You had Latin being used by the Roman military and government officials.
Like Pilate.
Right. You had Greek functioning as the lingua franca of commerce and broader Mediterranean communication. You had Hebrew, which was primarily the sacred language of liturgy and scripture in the synagogues.
Okay, so 3 languages already.
But the daily language of the Jewish people in that region, the language of the home, the street, and the marketplace, was Aramaic.
And Aramaic is a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew, but distinct enough that they aren't totally mutually intelligible.
Correct. It is a bedrock, universally established fact of New Testament historical scholarship that Jesus of Nazareth spoke a Galilean dialect of Aramaic as his primary vernacular.
Wow.
And we know this not just from historical context, but because the gospel writers themselves left us direct evidence. Even though Mark and Matthew are composing their sweeping narratives in Greek, they occasionally stop translating and give us the exact phonetic Aramaic words that Jesus spoke.
Those are some of my favorite moments in the Gospels where the text suddenly feels like a documentary recording. Like in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus heals the young girl, the text says he took her by the hand and said, Talitha kumi, which the writer then has to translate for his Greek audience as, little girl, I say to you, arise.
Exactly. Or when he heals the deaf and mute man in the Decapolis, he looks up to heaven, sighs, and says, Ephatha, which means be opened.
Oh, right.
And most famously, in his final agonizing moments on the cross, he cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Those are preserved phonetic audio recordings of the Aramaic language echoing through the Greek text.
They are linguistic breadcrumbs. They remind the reader that the underlying reality of these events was deeply Semitic, not Hellenistic.
So we know with absolute certainty that Jesus spoke Aramaic. How does this Aramaic substratum connect back to our sacrificial bull? Where does the connection happen?
It happens in one of the most famous, majestic titles of Christ found in the entire New Testament. It is a title found in the apocalyptic visions of the book of Revelation, specifically Revelation chapter 1, verse 8.
I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty.
Yes. In the Greek manuscript of Revelation, the phrase is ego imi to alpha kai to u. I am the Alpha and the Omega. Alpha being the very first letter of the Greek alphabet, and Omega being the very last letter.
It's a beautiful way of saying, I am the beginning and the end. I encompass everything.
It is. But if we want to understand the profound Christological depths of this statement, we have to ask a fundamental question about the cultural and linguistic mindset of the speaker.
Okay, what question?
The book of Revelation presents this as a direct quote from the ascended Christ. If Jesus is a Semitic speaker, deeply rooted in the Jewish first-century theological framework, communicating his divine identity, what letters is he actually conceptualizing in his mind?
Well, logic dictates he wouldn't naturally be using Greek letters to describe his eternal identity to a Jewish disciple like John. He would frame his identity using his own alphabet.
Precisely. In the first century, the Aramaic language was written down using what is called the Square Hebrew or Assyrian script.
Okay.
It is the exact same alphabet used to write the Hebrew Torah scrolls. So the conceptual metaphor of being the first and the last, of spanning the entirety of existence, would not have been internally expressed using Greek letters.
That makes total sense.
What is rendered in the Greek text as Alpha and Omega would have been naturally spoken, understood, and conceptualized in a Jewish context as the first and last letters of the Hebrew Aramaic alphabet.
And the first and last letters of that alphabet are?
Aleph and Tav.
Aleph and Tav. So when we read the English translation of the Greek, I am the Alpha and the Omega, Frank Leo is arguing that we should really be hearing the Aramaic reality, I am the Aleph and the Tav.
Yes.
But honestly, I want to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
It sounds like an amazing theory, but the book of Revelation wasn't written to Jewish fishermen in Galilee. John wrote Revelation in Greek, and he specifically addressed it to 7 Greek-speaking churches in Asia Minor places like Ephesus and Smyrna.
That's true.
Isn't it a massive speculative leap for us, 2,000 years later, to reverse engineer a Greek letter back into an Aramaic mindset when the original audience clearly spoke Greek?
That is a very robust, necessary pushback. It would indeed be a speculative leap if we were modern scholars inventing this reverse engineering out of thin air. We aren't.
We aren't.
No, we have historical textual proof that the earliest Aramaic-speaking Christians did exactly this. We don't have to guess, we just have to look at the Peshitta.
The Peshitta. Frank Leo references this heavily, but can you unpack what the Peshitta actually is for the listener? Because it's not a text most Western Christians are familiar with.
The Peshitta is the ancient standard Syriac translation of the Bible. Syriac is a dialect of Middle Aramaic that emerged in the city of Edessa in Upper Mesopotamia.
Okay.
It became the liturgical and literary language of a massive branch of Eastern Christianity. The roots of the Peshitta translation date back as early as the 2nd century CE.
So we are talking about a community of Christians who lived just a few generations after Christ, whose daily language was incredibly close to the Aramaic dialect that Jesus himself spoke.
Exactly. They read, prayed, and worshipped in a Semitic language. So the critical question for our deep dive is this. How did the translators of the Peshitta handle Revelation 1.8?
Right.
When they were translating the Greek text of Revelation back into Syriac Aramaic, did they just take the Greek words Alpha and Omega and spell them out phonetically in Syriac?
I would assume so. If someone hands you a text that says Alpha and Omega, you translate it as Alpha and Omega?
That is the brilliant part. They do not.
Wait, really?
Really, they didn't engage in mechanical, literal word-for-word translation. The translators of the Peshitta understood something profound about dynamic equivalence.
What do you mean?
They understood that the theological point of the verse wasn't about the specific physical Greek letters Alpha and Omega. The point was about expressing the totality of the divine identity by spanning an entire alphabet, from the absolute beginning to the absolute end.
So they localized it to their own cultural context.
They performed a deliberate theological contextualization. In the Syriac text of the Peshitta, Revelation 1.8 explicitly reads, Ina Alaf du Ta. I am Aleph and Ta.
Oh.
Or, using the standard Hebrew pronunciation, Aleph and Tav. The ancient translators purposefully discarded the Greek letters and swapped them out for the first and last letters of their own Semitic alphabet because they knew that was the only way to preserve the true underlying meaning of the title.
That actually makes perfect sense. Like, if I want to tell someone in English that I have every detail completely handled, I say I've got it covered from A to Z.
Right.
But if you translate that idiom into a language that doesn't use the Latin alphabet, say Russian or Arabic, you wouldn't translate A and Z. It would sound like gibberish. You would use their own first and last letters to convey the meaning of everything.
Precisely. And this historical restoration, moving from the Greek alpha and omega back to the Aramaic aleph and tav, is not just a neat piece of linguistic trivia. No, it is the master key that unlocks the entire Christological mystery we are exploring today. Because in ancient Hebrew and Aramaic, the letters aleph and tav are not just abstract shapes that instruct you on how to vibrate your vocal cords like our modern English letters. They are so much more than that.
This brings us to the visual element of the alphabet, which is where things get almost eerie in their precision. I was thinking about how to explain this, and I realized that ancient letters are essentially compressed data files.
I like that.
Right. Think about our English letter A. It's just two slanted diagonal lines and a horizontal crossbar. Inherently, visually, it means nothing on its own. It's just geometry.
Right.
But Paleo-Hebrew letters are like a compressed zip folder on your computer desktop. When you understand the history of the letter, you can double-click aleph and tav, and an entire, incredibly detailed theological system of sacrifice decompresses right in front of your eyes.
That is a phenomenal modern analogy for how these letters functioned in antiquity. To understand how that zip file actually works, we have to leave the 1st century Roman era and travel even further back in time. We have to go back to the very origins of the alphabet itself.
So we are moving away from the Aramaic spoken by Jesus, and we are going back to the Proto-Sinaitic script. We're talking 1800 to 1500 BCE, right around the time of the biblical patriarchs, or the Exodus.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Before the invention of the alphabet, writing was incredibly complex. You had Sumerian cuneiform, which used hundreds of wedge-shaped marks to represent syllables.
Okay.
And you had Egyptian hieroglyphs, which used thousands of pictures to represent words, sounds, and ideas. It took years of specialized training to become a scribe.
Yeah, you couldn't just casually read it.
Exactly. But somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula, possibly among Semitic laborers working in Egyptian turquoise mines at Serabit el-Qadim, a revolutionary new system was invented, the alphabet. And this earliest script, Proto-Sinaitic, and its direct descendant, Paleo-Hebrew, operated on what is called the acrophonic principle.
The acrophonic principle. Let's break down exactly how that works, because this is the engine of Frank Leo's entire argument.
Acrophony means that each letter of the alphabet originated as a distinct pictograph, a simplified, rudimentary drawing of a concrete, physical object from daily life. The sound that the letter made was simply the very first sound of the spoken word for that object.
Okay, so let's try to invent an acrophonic alphabet in English right now so the listener can visualize this. If we were starting from scratch, the letter B might just be a little line drawing of a boat.
Exactly.
And every time you saw the drawing of the boat, you wouldn't say the word boat, you would just make the boo sound.
Precisely. Or a drawing of a snake would represent the S sound. Over hundreds of years, scribes write quickly, the drawings get sloppy, they get simplified, they get turned sideways, and eventually people forget that the B was ever a boat.
It just becomes an abstract shape.
Right. But in the beginning, every letter was a picture of something real.
So if we apply the acrophonic principle to the two letters Jesus claims as his identity, aleph and tav, we aren't just looking at sounds, we are looking at ancient pictures. Let's start with aleph, the first letter of the alphabet. What is the original Proto-Sinaitic and Paleo-Hebrew pictograph for the letter aleph?
The original pictograph for aleph is an ox head.
An ox head?
It is a literal, recognizable drawing of a bovine head, complete with a snout and two distinct horns protruding from the top.
Wow.
Yes. The ancient Semitic word aleph literally meant ox, bull, or head of cattle. And if you trace the history of the alphabet, you can actually see the ox head slowly turn on its side in Phoenician, and then eventually turn upside down when it was adopted by the Greeks to become the letter alpha.
Oh, wait. The two legs of our modern capital A?
Yes. The two legs of our modern capital A are actually the two horns of the ancient ox pointing downward.
That is incredible. And remember what we discussed in the very beginning of this deep dive about the symbolic attributes of the ox in the ancient Near East.
We discuss how it represents strength, power, leadership, and vital agricultural energy. It was the most powerful domesticated animal in their world.
So the very first letter of the alphabet, the aleph, visually and conceptually represents the ox. My mind is already racing ahead here because if Aleph is physically a drawing of an ox, and we've already spent the first half of this deep dive establishing that the ultimate Levitical sacrifice, the par, the primary sin offering for the highest sins, is the bull, we suddenly have a direct visual link.
Yes, we do.
But we need the other bookend. We need to look at the last letter, the tav. What is the ancient acrophonic pictograph for the letter tav?
This is where the historical typology becomes breathtaking in its clarity. The original pictograph for the letter tav in Paleo-Hebrew is a cross.
A cross.
It is two intersecting lines drawn to form either an X shape or a lowercase t or plus shape.
A cross. The very last letter of the ancient Hebrew alphabet is literally a drawing of a cross.
Yes. The word tav itself translates literally to mark, sign, or cross. It was used as a signature for someone who couldn't read or write. They would simply make their mark, their tav.
Okay, that makes sense.
And we see this exact visual concept explicitly used in the theology of the Hebrew Bible. If you look at the book of Ezekiel, chapter 9, verse 4, the prophet describes a vision where God is speaking to a heavenly messenger about sparing the righteous inhabitants of Jerusalem from impending judgment.
Okay.
The divine command is given, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a tav upon the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed within it.
Set a tav on their foreheads, put a mark on them, put a cross on them.
The Hebrew text is literally saying, use this specific letter, the intersecting lines, as a visible symbol of divine protection, ownership, and covenant grace. Those marked by the cross of the tav are saved from destruction.
Okay, so let's pull all of this together. Let's reconstruct the statement from Revelation based on everything we've uncovered. In the Greek New Testament, Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega.
Right.
We translate that Hellenistic phrase back into the cultural and linguistic Aramaic reality of the speaker, and it becomes, I am the Aleph and the Tav. And then we take Aleph and Tav back to their ancient Paleo-Hebrew pictographic roots, and they become what?
They become, I am the ox and I am the cross.
I am the ox and I am the cross.
The theological depth of that statement is staggering. When Christ identifies himself as the Aleph and the Tav, he's not merely making a philosophical statement about the chronology of time, I am the beginning and the end, although that is certainly true.
Sure.
At the deeply embedded pictographic level of the ancient script, he is making a sovereign declaration that compresses and summarizes the entire sacrificial theology of the Old Testament.
He is saying, I am the sacrificial ox and I am the sacrificial altar.
Exactly. The Aleph visually proclaims Christ as the ultimate sacrifice itself. He's the young bull of the sin offering.
Wow.
He is the strong, powerful par that is slaughtered for the atonement of the highest sins of the people. He is the Moskos from the Greek Septuagint, whose blood must be carried into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur to reconcile humanity with absolute holiness.
And the Tav proclaims the instrument of that sacrifice.
Yes. The Tav visually proclaims the place and the method of the sacrifice. It is the cross. It is the mark of the covenant. It is the ultimate sign of redemption that protects the faithful from judgment, echoing the protective mark in Ezekiel.
It is a single, perfectly compressed theological utterance. 2 letters. And inside those 2 letters, you have both the victim and the altar. You have the ultimate Old Testament legal requirement and the ultimate New Testament fulfillment perfectly united.
It's incredible.
It's as if the very architecture of human language, the physical geometry of the alphabet invented in the Sinai desert millennia ago, was sovereignly designed to point to this one specific moment in first century history.
It suggests a profound intentional unity in the biblical narrative. It argues that this specific truth, that the divine sacrifice would involve an ox-like figure of supreme strength being offered on an intersecting cross, was embedded in the visual shapes of the Hebrew alphabet centuries before the Roman Empire ever existed, let alone invented crucifixion as a method of execution.
This is genuinely mind-bending, but Frank Leo's study doesn't stop with the letters of the alphabet. Because if this is true, if Christ is typologically the divine ox, the Aleph, then we should logically expect to see this specific ox figure show up somewhere else in the ancient narrative texts in a way that prefigures the New Testament story.
We should.
Right. If the ox is the blueprint should be visible in the law.
It should. And remarkably, it is. This brings us to the final and perhaps most narratively startling piece of the puzzle, the typological connection found in the book of Exodus regarding the civil case law of the goring ox.
So we are moving away from the ritual purity codes of Leviticus, and we're looking at the civil statutes in Exodus. We're looking at property law and personal injury. Set the stage for us here.
We need to examine a very specific somewhat obscure piece of case law in Exodus chapter 21, verse 32. Ancient Near Eastern legal codes, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, often dealt with the economic liabilities of livestock.
Okay.
Exodus is no different. It lays out the penalties for what happens if your animal damages someone else's property.
I have the translation right here from Frank Leo's source material. It says, if the ox gores a male servant or a female servant, 30 shekels of silver shall be given to their master, and the ox shall be stoned.
Let's break down the elements of this law very carefully because the typology here unfolds with absolute terrifying precision when laid over the gospel narrative.
All right, let's do it.
The Hebrew word used for the ox in this specific verse is shor. In the Greek Septuagint translation, it is rendered as toros. And just to maintain our linguistic consistency with the first half of our deep dive, if we look at how this word was pronounced in the ancient synagogues using Origen's Secunda Hexapla, it was vocalized as ashur.
So we have an ox, a shor, and the law is dealing with the specific scenario of what happens if this powerful ox gores a servant.
Right.
Now, I have to stop here because when I first read this part of the study, I had a hard time squaring the imagery. An ox goring someone is a violent, bloody, aggressive image. It implies severe trauma.
It does.
How in the world do we reconcile that violent, destructive imagery with a savior figure who comes offering grace, healing, and peace? It feels like a massive mismatch in tone.
That is a very natural reaction. Modern readers associate Jesus with gentle pastoral imagery, again, the lamb. But to understand the typology, we have to look closely at the specific Hebrew verb used for goring in this verse.
What's the word?
The word is nagak. Now, while it is appropriately translated as goring in an agricultural context, the root connotation of nagak is much broader. It is about striking, pushing, or making forceful, disruptive contact with the horns. It is about a powerful encounter that fundamentally alters the status quo.
A forceful touch.
Yes. Now, map this typology directly onto the ministry of Christ. The ox of the shore represents Christ. He is the Aleph. He is the powerful, living, working servant of God who forcefully enters the human sphere.
Okay.
And what happens when he enters the world? He comes into contact with humanity. He touches the servants, the marginalized, the enslaved, the sinners, those bound by religious legalism, disease, and demonic oppression.
He makes forceful contact, and if you read the Gospels, that contact is often profoundly disruptive. I'm thinking of the story where Jesus casts the legion of demons out of the man and into the herd of pigs.
Yes, that's a perfect example.
The man is healed, but the local townspeople are so terrified by the sheer uncontainable power of what Jesus just did that they actually beg him to leave their region. His grace was terrifying to them.
Exactly. Grace isn't always gentle. Sometimes grace is a disruptive, forceful intrusion into a broken, stagnant system. Christ's miracles, his overturning of the tables in the temple, his absolute claims to divine authority, these were forceful, jarring encounters. They struck the consciousness of the religious and political leaders of his day. They were a nagak.
So the goring, the nagak, and the Exodus law is actually a typological shadow of the collision between absolute divine holiness and human frailty and sin.
That is the theological reality. And here is where the profound tragedy of the encounter is revealed. This forceful touch, this nagak of the divine ox, was entirely meant for salvation. It was meant to liberate the servants from their bondage.
But how did the servants, particularly the leadership, react to that touch?
They were deeply offended by it. They rejected it entirely.
They perceived the touch of the ox as an injury, an existential threat to their power rather than a gift of healing. They recoiled from the holiness.
Exactly. The divine encounter that was designed for liberation became, in their minds, the occasion for condemnation. But, crucially, under the law of Exodus 21, who is ultimately condemned and held liable for the encounter?
The ox. The ox is put on trial. The animal is blamed for the disruption, which leads us directly to the penalty phase in Exodus 21.32. What is the legal price demanded for this encounter?
The law states that the master of the servant must be compensated for the disruption. And the exact legislative price demanded is 30 shekels of silver. In biblical Hebrew, the phrase is kisef shaloshim sheklim.
30 pieces of silver.
Yes.
You really don't even have to be a biblical scholar and go to seminary to know what that specific number means. It is one of the most infamous numbers in human history.
It really is.
That is the exact specific price that Judas Iscariot was paid to betray Jesus to the religious authorities. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verse 15, Judas asks the chief priests, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And the text says, and they paid him 30 pieces of silver.
It is an exact numerical match. Now, the evangelist Matthew explicitly links this payment to a prophetic vision in Zechariah chapter 11, where a shepherd's wages are sarcastically valued at 30 pieces of silver. So the New Testament writers were already highly aware of this specific numerical typology.
Right.
But frankly, as research points us back even further to the original foundational establishment of this price in the civil law of Exodus, centering it entirely on the figure of the ox.
Let's talk about the economics of that for a second, because the layers of irony here are just devastating. In the context of ancient Near Eastern law, 30 shekels of silver isn't a fortune.
No, not at all.
It is the standard compensation price for a common slave.
Yeah.
It's the baseline indemnity rate you pay if your livestock accidentally damages someone else's replaceable property.
It is effectively the lowest possible valuation of human life in that specific economic system.
Yeah.
It is the price of a laborer.
And in the gospel narrative, that exact insulting sum becomes the price at which the Son of God, the creator of the universe, is valued by his own creation.
It's tragic.
The divine ox, the Aleph, the being who possesses ultimate cosmic power and authority, is sold for the literal price of a damaged slave. It is a completely inverted, upside-down economy.
It is a staggering humiliation, and it is a necessary part of the theological narrative. The divine takes on the lowest possible status. But the typology of the Exodus law demands one final chilling step to complete the cycle.
Right.
The liability is established. The 30 pieces of silver change hands. The master is compensated. But what happens to the ox?
The law in Exodus says, "And the ox shall be stoned." The ox is executed by the community.
The execution completes the typology. The divine ox, the Aleph, who entered the world to forcefully touch and heal the broken servants, is killed. He's not merely rejected, exiled, or beaten. He is utterly destroyed by public execution.
Wow.
And the darkest, most profound irony of all is that the very one who came to liberate the servants is executed at the explicit, screaming demand of the servants he came to save.
The crowd in Pilate's courtyard yells, "Crucify him!" The servants demand the death of the ox. The state sanctions the execution. And we are right back to the cross. We are right back to the Tav.
It is a perfectly closed narrative and typological loop.
This is a lot to process. The way these different texts and languages interlock is genuinely breathtaking. Let's take a breath and recap the sheer, massive architectural unity of what we've just explored in this deep dive, because we have covered a tremendous amount of ground.
It requires a synthesis of history, linguistics, and theology to really see the whole picture.
Okay, so we started by dismantling a cultural assumption. We looked past the popular docile imagery of the lamb, which has dominated art and culture for centuries.
Right.
We went straight to the Levitical Code, the original rulebook, and established that the young bull, the par, is actually the supreme primary sin offering. The blood of the bull is what is required for the highest sins and what enters the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur.
We established the theological primacy of the bull over the lamb.
Then we confronted the language barrier. We recognized that the New Testament was written in Greek, but Jesus spoke Aramaic. We looked at Origen's Secunda Hexapla to understand how words were actually pronounced in ancient synagogues.
The far.
Right, the far. And then we moved from the Greek phrase alpha and omega back to the Aramaic reality of aleph and tav. And we validated that move by looking at the Peshitta, the ancient Syriac translation, where early Aramaic-speaking Christians deliberately contextualized those Greek letters back into their own Semitic alphabet.
We found the linguistic bridge connecting the Hellenistic text to the Semitic reality.
From there, we took those two specific letters, aleph and tav, and we traced them all the way back to their Proto-Sinaitic and Paleo-Hebrew origins, relying on the acrophonic principle. And we found that the original ancient pictograph for aleph is an ox, the ultimate symbol of power and sacrifice.
Yes.
And the pictograph for tav is literally a cross, the mark of the covenant and protection.
The letters themselves provided the visual prefiguration of the crucifixion. I am the sacrificial ox, and I am the sacrificial altar.
And finally, we watch this exact, highly specific typology play out as a narrative sequence in the case law Exodus 21. The ox enters the world, makes a forceful touch and a gawk with the servant. The servant's masters reject the encounter. The exact price of 30 pieces of silver is paid, and the ox is condemned to death by the community.
It's all there.
It is a single, continuous tapestry woven from the first letter of the alphabet to the last.
And this, I think, is the most crucial practical takeaway for you, the listener, as you process everything in this deep dive today. We live in an era of intense information overload.
We really do.
We are conditioned to skim the surface of texts, to read the summary, to rely on the popular culturally synthesized images, like the gentle lamb, because they are easy to digest and demand very little of us. But this study by Frank Leo proves that there is profound, world-altering value in slowing down. There is immense reward in digging into the linguistic dirt of history. When you take the time to look at how words were pronounced in ancient synagogues, when you study the physical evolution of ancient alphabets, you discover that these ancient texts are not just a random, chaotic collection of disparate rules and stories. They possess an astonishing, highly unified architecture.
It's like discovering the master code hidden inside the operating system. We thought we were just reading a dry list of animal sacrifices in Leviticus and looking at some random Greek letters in Revelation, but it turns out the entire linguistic structure was a synchronized countdown.
It demonstrates a typological coherence that spans thousands of years, multiple languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and completely different literary genres.
Right.
You have legal codes in Exodus, apocalyptic visions in Revelation, and historical narratives in the Gospels, and they all miraculously align on this single, robust, ancient truth of the Aleph and the Tav.
I'm going to be thinking about this for a very long time, especially the next time I see a stained glass window of a lamb. It's hard to unsee the ox once you know it's there. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day.
This is a good one.
We've just spent this time exploring how the very shapes of the letters in an ancient alphabet letters carved into stone in the Sinai desert millennia ago were secretly, visually pointing toward a future historical event. The ox and the cross.
A physical prophecy embedded in the alphabet.
So what does that say about the nature of language itself? We treat language like it's just a utilitarian tool. We treat words like they're just disposable vehicles we invented to order coffee or send a quick text message or write an email. But if Frank Leo's research holds true, is it possible that language is far more profound and perhaps far more intentionally designed than that? Is it possible that the words we speak every single day, the letters we type on our keyboards, contain hidden architectures, ancient blueprints, just waiting for us to trace them back to their absolute source? The next time you write a letter or read a sign on the street, just wonder what else might be hidden in the shapes.
The truly fascinating question to leave them with.
We started this deep dive talking about how muddy and confusing history can be, and how our popular imagination gets clouded by centuries of cultural repetition. But today, thanks to the Aramaic roots, the Secunda hexapla, and those incredible ancient pictographs, the muddy waters have cleared.
They have.
The X-ray into the text is working perfectly, and right there on the screen, clear as day, from the beginning to the end, is the ox and the cross.